Timothy Lomperis, thank you very much for joining us. And you've written a number of books about Vietnam. Your memoir is called The Vietnam War from the Rear Echelon. I have to be honest, when I read the title, I thought, well, this probably isn't going to be very interesting. But then as I got through it, it is a very interesting memoir. It's a very unique memoir. I haven't read anything like it. One of the things one of the things that's very helpful to me is that, I just haven't talked to very many veterans who were in Vietnam as late as you were, just simply for the simple reason that there weren't very many people there. I think the number you give is that by 1973, there were about 9,000 Americans left in South Vietnam. Yeah. Is that right? That's obviously a small number compared to the 500,000 we had, I think, in 1969. So it's a privilege to be able to talk to you for that reason, one of a small number of Americans who is there. In this conversation, I wanted to, we'll have a separate conversation on sort of the meat of your memoir, some of the themes that come up. In this conversation, I kind of wanted to talk with you about something you described at the end of your memoir. One of the themes that comes up several times in the memoir is this feeling of what's the right word? Alienation or something like that because of anti-war protest at home, anti-war sentiment at home. Pretty early on, you describe an incident in a coffee house in Philadelphia where you deal with, you're confronted by anti-war people. There's really a powerful, I find it as a powerful passage in your memoir, and perhaps we can get you to read that, where you describe this sense of, you say in your memoir, I was an American, but I felt more comfortable being an American outside of the United States. And maybe part of that has to do with growing up as a missionary kid in India. That probably is the case. I think you say so.
Right. No, that's true.
But but one of the things you describe is as you move into your career as a professor, kind of this spirit of divisiveness that existed during the war kind of continued, and just as a professor to a professor. Although you're one who actually experienced Vietnam. I mean, I've been there, but, obviously the Vietnam I've seen is very, very different from the one you saw in the early 70s. But what has that been like for you as a veteran of the Vietnam War, an intelligence officer in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War, also a civilian working in the field of intelligence in South Vietnam? Feeling that the cause was, or you felt committed to the cause. You seem to indicate you feel like this country, should have. My sense is you feel that this country should have stood by South Vietnam rather than let it be overcome in 75. Right. So I'll just pitch the question generally. I mean, what has it been like for you as a professor writing about Vietnam, but taking a point of view that isn't anti-war or anti-Vietnam, or is not cynical in the way that that you often get from the university? Did you get the gist of what I'm asking?
Yeah, I got. No, it was very difficult. It was very difficult because for so many of my colleagues, Vietnam was the sacred symbol of defeat. It was the war it was the war to prove that we were an interventionist country and the just aspirations of third world societies. It was a horrible mistake, and I was also told to stay out of writing about Vietnam. They were shark-infested waters. It would ruin my career. I felt morally committed, and I still feel this today. I mean, I felt that I was experiencing the almost permanent division in the American polity. I thought this war was dividing the heart of America. And I feel that the what's going on in the Trump trial right now is a reflection of the, I mean, if you're looking for the origins of this division, this sort of irreconcilable split, I think it really stems with two very, very different narratives on the Vietnam War. That it was the noble cause, you know, Podhoretz's book, it was the most moral war we ever fought, versus this was a case of getting rid of our neo-imperialist aggressiveness, and this is purging us. We'll never do this again. And I also felt this was a very ambiguous war, that the truth was very difficult to winnow out. And what I wanted to be sure of is that we didn't go around and carry false lessons from the war, that we understood that we needed to preserve the ambiguities and the general complexities to this war, that it should not be allowed to carry the lesson of either of these two views. So I personally was committed to the war. I felt this abandonment of my South Vietnamese friends in very personal terms. I also felt that the country lost its moral compass. I felt that as a result of our refusal to, to honor our commitments to the Vietnamese, that we had descended from an exceptional country to a country like no others. And the way we've abandoned the Kurds now in Syria is no different from the way we abandoned the Hmong in Laos and the South Vietnamese. I mean, in other words, the tragedy of Vietnam is that as a result of Vietnam, our poor allies can only trust us up to a certain point. We are a trustworthy ally of very limited depth.
Mm.
And so I'm very alienated by what Vietnam did to the American soul. And I felt a commitment to try to, and that's why I dedicated my scholarly career to writing on the Vietnam War, to sort of to hell with all these sharks in the waters. I'm going to engage the culture to try to let the ambiguities of this war live on. So people are forced into making their own moral choices and not rely on these sort of easily rendered lessons.
Mm.
Well, it became a life's calling, if you will, and so I suffered for it. But I guess in St. Paul's term, I feel I fought the good fight.
Yeah. Well, your book, I mean, the memoir reflects an attention to detail, a carefulness, a scholarly carefulness. It's a really interesting mix, because it'll go for pages of just sort of giving historical background and going into significant detail, combined with personal reflections. You get this. It is an interesting mix of scholarly carefulness that kind of is a foundation, and then, or that's a major element of the memoir. Then what you add to it then is there is definitely a spirit of ambiguity in it, of murkiness of what's going on. You describe some, you describe some interesting moments. I don't know if you have a response to this. It so happens that I finally got around to reading Graham Greene's Quiet American.
Oh yeah, right.
Actually, in Saigon, just a few weeks.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I read it, and I would take it out in 10, 15, 20-page chunks at different cafes in Saigon. And as I was reading your memoir, I thought, wow, I mean, Graham Greene's Quiet American and this memoir would really be wonderful companion pieces.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that is good.
Yeah, do you have any reflections on, again, we're kind of speaking prof to prof, but do you have any, I don't know how long it's been since you've read Greene's novel, but do you have any reflections on that? You mentioned...
Well, I always assigned that novel in my intro IR class, because I felt it was really, it was short, for one thing.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I think it really showed the dynamic of Western power intervening in a third world country, and these sort of two cultures that didn't understand each other. Mm-hmm. The idea that Vigo at one point is so disgusted with Americans because their bathrooms were air conditioned.
Mm.
You
Yeah.
know, the coming in from a very wealthy, prosperous country into a country who is so impoverished that they don't care about all these ideological issues that prompted the intervention. They're just trying to figure out how to survive. And that's the thing I found about Saigon that was so interesting was the ways in which you had in day-to-day living, people living a survivalist ethic, not an ethic of justice or order. You know, when you live in a sort of civil society, everybody is arguing about different versions of justice. When justice is irrelevant to the basic issues of survival, you have cultures develop around survivalism. So prostitutes make more money than bureaucrats.
You mentioned that in the memoir.
I mean, you enter a world of, in biblical terms, I really felt I was living in a world of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die.
Which may help to explain the rife corruption which you write about and which pretty much everybody who went to South Vietnam talks about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, I mean, I even remember Dr. Zhivago and even the Civil War, Gone with the Wind. I mean, war profiteering is the very essence of any war, and especially when you're in the rear where the sort of the focal point of the wealth of the American intervention impacts the capital city, and as Key called, turns the world upside down.
Yeah.
So you're living in what he called the big upside down. I'm actually going to be teaching a Sunday school class on war, and I think one of the lingering effects of any war is the habituation to the corrosion of morals. I mean, I think that what came back from Vietnam was people used to drugs, people used to whores, people used to not worrying about marital commitments anymore. I mean, one of the things that I noted was all of these officer friends of mine who had these wives for a year. But I also remember when I was in language school in Monterey, I was in language school there, and there was a waiting wives club. Yeah. And I would go to these happy hours and found all these married women on the prowl. And I think the corrosion, I mean, so there are lingering aftershocks that are probably almost more long-term corrosive than the actual trauma of the war itself.
I hear that, and you describe these things. I remember you described one club where, you know, you can stay downstairs and have drinks, or you can go upstairs and engage in other activities.
Right.
And, what you say is that most of the guys who went upstairs were the married ones.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. It blew my mind. I mean, the whole experience blew my mind. So it's taken me 4 books to get it out. Well, I don't know if it's out of my system yet, but it's been living with me a long time.
Yeah. Well, in a separate conversation, we'll get into some of the key themes of your memoir. I think just to wrap this one up, I was very struck by the end of your memoir, really the last little bit. And you know, you're sort of writing about coming to terms with Vietnam. Do you have the book right there?
Yes, I do.
I wonder if you could go to page 219.
Okay, let me put my glasses on.
Really, to read, I'd love to hear you read the very last paragraph. What I wrote in the margin is Thomas Aquinas, and I don't know if this is the case, but I've heard that after long, arduous intellectual work, you know, just writing so much, Thomas Aquinas at some point just made a turn and said, you know what, enough with this stuff. I'm going to focus on things of the spirit. And, you know, I believe he becomes a contemplative or something like that.
Oh, really? No, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And I believe, anyway, that's what I've heard. And that's what I wrote in the margin by the very last paragraph. Not that you're giving up on, you know, academics and the life of the mind, but you do, the book does take a very spiritual turn in the last 2 pages. I wonder if you could read the last.
Yeah, that's the very last paragraph of the book. Okay.
Yeah. Could you read the last paragraph for us?
Sure.
Then I'd just love to hear you reflect on that a little bit.
Okay. As the living out of my life pulled me further away from this war, and I read the Bible more deeply and studied it with fellow church members, I came to understand that this kingdom of truth was rooted in God's love, not his reason. Furthermore, in this kingdom, there are no scarce resources. God's love is freely there for everyone in limitless amounts. There is enough for me, my family, my friends, my country, my enemies, and yes, for Colonels Vu Van Ya, Huang Nok Lung too. In God's kingdom, there are no trade-offs and no politics. There is just as limitless love. In the second conclusion of forsaking my political ambitions, I have found my own Yai Fung for liberation. Like Q in her renunciation of desire, I have discovered my heart in the embrace of the kingdom of God. And this is not such a bad thing from this bad war. From the story and study of war, I have found my peace. I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to hear you.
True. I mean, and I'm actually writing a book that's very much stalled by other things called Heaven Can't Wait, How Beliefs in Heaven Determine Political Calculations on Earth.
Wow.
And I come to the conclusion that the kingdom of God, that whether we live in three worlds, those of us who are Christians, we live in the material world of circumstance. We live in the promise of the heavenly kingdom beyond our world, and then there's the intermediate kingdom of God on earth. You know, in the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And, you know, I began to, so what is the essence of this kingdom of earth? And I think I came to the conclusion that's in the last paragraph of the book, which I've been expanding in this other book, that the key feature of God's kingdom is that it doesn't play by politics. It doesn't play by scarce resources and the compromises that have to be made by scarce resources. It's not really rooted in justice, because for me the problem with justice is at the heart of justice is revenge. And love goes beyond that. And when we need to convey to others is the limitlessness of this love. We don't have to make trade-offs. It's all inclusive, and it even includes my enemies. You know, the bonds of separation should dissolve in the centrality of the cross. And you know, I have been trying to figure out how, as my other struggle is how, as a Christian academic whose Christianity is responsible for me surviving the war in terms of some of the more dangerous things that happen to people, and so how do I bring that to this world of reason? You know, and I've really tried to convey to my students that, especially when you're looking at things like war and the terrible rips to the fabric of society that every war engenders, you know, that there is reason, but there is revelation, and the academy almost obliterates any access to revelation as a source of truth. I felt as a calling, I needed it. How can I bring, without trying to be, you know, proselytizing of students, how can you bring to the academic world a place for other forms of truth besides reason?
Well, let me ask you that I mean, you've sort of pitched that question, and let me ask that question again, although in a different way, and I'd love to hear your response. You know, honestly, I don't think I'd even gotten out of graduate school before I'd given up on the idea of academic conferences being interesting. These are the most stultifying, soul-destroying events I've been to, and I've almost completely given up on them. But let's say, I mean, you know, again, I'm talking prof to prof. You're in this context, and you know, you just met with this posturing, with this you know, pseudo sophistication, which has nothing to do with the love of learning. It has everything to do with the promotion of the self, this relentless cynicism.
Correct.
Everything that has done so much damage to the world of higher education.
I'm with you on that 100%.
Yeah. So, you know, this spirit of love, I mean, in my case, I've just said, I'm not going. I mean, I'm just not going to participate in that stuff. It's just, I can't stand it.
Yeah.
But, you know,
They
but
were never pleasant experiences for me. It took me a while to decontaminate after I came back.
I'll bet. I mean, so what, you know, let's imagine you're actually speaking to a group of young teachers, of young professors who hear what you're saying about the disposition of love. And it's possible to be intellectual and spiritual. It's possible to be intellectual and motivated by love. These things don't have to be contrary to one another.
Right.
What would your advice be to young profs who feel the acid of the cynicism that pervades much of higher education, but they want to resist it? They want to act on what you're talking about, this disposition of love. What would you say?
Well, you know, I had two opportunities to address precisely what you're saying. I was at SLU. I was voted to give the first of the last lecture series.
Yeah, yeah.
And what would this? And so I really focused this on the call of faith. And I said, you really need to. The life of the mind is one of God's most special gifts. And we need, those of us who are in this world need to understand where our gifts come from. And we need to be humble about that, especially with our students, because what really happens when you get into the world of the mind is that you begin to understand partly the full array of your ignorance. Mm. The other thing that I've said several times is that, you know, as academics, we've lost the sort of the 19th century or whatever, the sort of the holistic nature of the professoriate, where people like Durkheim talked about the whole range of social science and the humanities. We have become so insulated by these highly specialized disciplinary silos. Our students don't care about these disciplines. I
had a conversation with a student yesterday on this very theme. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't. They want to know. They want to know how to find their place in the world. You know, and the problem we have is that when I went to graduate school, many of my professors had been in World War II, and had had the experience of engaging with the world, you know, seeing the compromises, seeing the holistic nature of human life. And I felt that was the advantage I had as a professor, is that I'd had that experience in Vietnam. I had, you know, the traumas of various degrees there that I was able to bring to the class, and that I was able to. I never really talked about political science all that much, and I mentioned that you need to let students know you know, as an intellectual, as a person, and where do you get your sense of calling from? Now, I got a lot of pushback. What do you mean by calling? What do you mean I just have a degree? I don't have any calling. You know, well, you know what that means is you should have some purpose beyond your scholarship. So I was at my retirement. I was able to tell them that, you know, as professors, we keep living in a world of questions, you know, but students want answers. And it's irresponsible not to at least point to suggestions and not to share some of your answers, because they don't want to leave. Fine to have provoking questions to get them to think about where their life fits in the larger scheme of things, but don't leave them hanging.
That's it. There is a thrill that comes with knocking students off balance, right?
Right, but the problem is you just leave them there.
Exactly. Yeah, I hear you. I'm with you 100% on that. So, just the last question. We'll wrap up this conversation and then turn to a separate one. So you I believe you used the phrase "suffered." You know, that you paid the price for your attempts to be even-handed, to have a sort of a broad, even-handed approach to the war, to really try to understand it. and to be as even-handed as you can. And apparently, you kind of indicate in the book, and I think you've indicated in something you said a few minutes ago, that you did experience sort of academic kickback from
Oh,
that.
yeah.
And just how did that manifest itself?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you heard it. Well, it manifested itself in a huge tenure battle. And I was denied tenure at Duke, and largely because of the scholarship. Now, they dressed it up. But that was the root of it. You know, then one of them says we can't have people like you in the professoriate. And
people like you, meaning somebody who isn't
who argues against the sort of this cultural icon as this great defeat, and this kind of religious approach you keep taking to things. I fought it for 5 years, so it was a long, drawn-out trauma. I got a lot of support, and in the end, you know, I went through a faculty hearing committee, and they ordered the department to carry an external review that the atmosphere towards me in the department was too poisoned for a scholarly evaluation of my scholarship. And the university refused to implement the hearing committee ordered it twice. I got a copy of a letter from the university council to the chair of the board of trustees saying they would implement the remedy. They claimed they never had the letter. I produced the letter, so they never carried out the remedy. And the chairman of the hearing committee said, you know, I'm ready to be deposed in your case. This is outrageous. And I thought about it a lot, and I realized, you know, that there was, talking about justice, I was feeling a very bad motive of vengeance. And I decided, you know, to follow the scripture, don't take thou shalt not take your brother to a suit in law or whatever. And I realized that even if I won, these were not Christ-like motives for me. You know, that this was getting even, this was just, and my decision not to sue has really engendered a kind of lifelong suspicion of justice, and of people who are constantly clamoring for justice. And I think there is entangled injustice and almost a dangerous inseparability from pride.
Well, because I know what justice is and you don't.
Exactly. Sort of I'm going to cram my version of justice down your throat.
Yeah. Well, let me wrap this up. I'm going to make a negative statement and a positive statement.
Okay.
The negative statement is that you may disagree with this, but you know, I mean, I've been in this world for 20 something years now. You were in it longer. If the people who are actually paying tuition knew about the utter nonsense that infests the universities in this country, there would just be a revolt, and my own sense is that this house of cards is in the process of coming down, and it deserves it. Now, the reason I say that is related to a positive, and that is, as I read your memoir and as I listen to you, I would be just absolutely delighted to know that my kids were in a class with you. Just hearing about your experiences, not only getting information, not only learning about history, but hearing from a true professor, that is someone who has something to profess, right? And that involves critique, and it's a complicated, dark world, and so cynicism maybe can't be avoided completely, right? But, you know, but a certain openness of spirit, and also a certain degree of humility, that I think I know what I know, but I might be wrong.
Right, you know? Right.
As opposed to just the relentless posturing that infests the academic world. So, you know, I hope you take that comment in the spirit it's meant, that it's true. Just talking to you, I thought, oh wow, if my kids had a class with this prof, I would, at least that class, I'd feel good about.
Well, thank you for that. I agree with you completely, except that I there are still good people around, you know.
Oh yeah, sure.
Like you, there are still good people around. There are still good courses to be had. I do enjoy the social company of people who live in the life of mine. By and large, friendships can be formed. But I also feel you're dead right in the negativity. I wrote an op-ed piece in our student newspaper, sort of like Martin Luther for debate, basically saying that the modern university has become a temple of the Gnostic heresy, where salvation is now seen as arising through knowledge. And it has banished faith from any place in education when they say Harvard says its motto is veritas, truth, and it is refusing to engage or allow a place for other forms of truth, and in that sense it is not providing an education, it is providing an ideology. And
that's right. On
those grounds civilizations fall. Nobody, left or right, talked to me at all about the editorial. They looked at me in stunned silence, you know, like I had said, I got no response from it except these kind of amazed looks when I walked across campus. So I knew I struck a chord, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We're going to have a separate conversation that gets into sort of the meat of your memoir.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this one. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to mouth off a little bit.
I appreciate it. Yeah. I'm good at that myself. Thanks a lot.